I'm excited to welcome this week's Tiara Talk Show guests, the creative team of CinéMagique.
Hello, I'm Ellen Raphael. I had the dubious title of production executive on this, and Pat Churchill was our line producer, and we sort of shared duties and did whatever was required at the moment.
I'm Tom Ackerman. I was fortunate to join this wonderful epic as the director of photography.
Hi, I'm Jerry Rees. I directed CinéMagique, and in addition to that, did story development early on and co-wrote with Steve Spiegel.
And I'm so excited. This has been something I've been dreaming of talking to you guys for a long time now, and I'm so grateful all three of you could join me for this conversation about, in my opinion, one of the, if not the best Disney attractions in the world out of everything. So really quickly before we start, I am going to let our listeners know that we are going to be talking tons about this film and spoilers, and I really want you to enjoy this in its full capacity, even though it's not at Disneyland Paris anymore. We'll talk about that later, but I have a link to the last show of CinéMagique that was from last March, and I put it in the show notes below, so please watch it in its entirety so you can understand what we're referring to in this conversation, because trust me, you're going to want to know. So it's going to be pretty confusing because we're going to be talking about all technical stuff. So, so first off, bravo. My gosh, this film was there at the park for over 15 years. My gosh.
Right. Yes. And what it was, 16,700,000 and change people that saw it. The project meant so much to all of us who worked on it. It's so great to have Tom and Ellen on the line with me now. It's heartwarming. Every time I think of the film and I see clips of the film, it just brings back wonderful memories. It was, in equal parts, a tremendous hill to climb and a challenge, but it was also about characters that we adored and we loved working with each other. So it just was such a wonderful, warm thing. And just watching it again, which I did this morning, the link that you sent. Something occurred to me fresh that I felt every time I was with an audience there, is that we had all this wonderful discovery and magic that was going on, and there was a lot of audience response that you would track through the film. It was great to see, but sort of the biggest reaction every time there was an audience there, every time I was present. The biggest reaction was not the special effect, the visual effect, but it was when the characters finally were reunited and hugged. I mean, the moment where they finally are at the end of their journey and they hug, they kiss, and the music swells, the whole audience goes nuts. And it just was a fresh reminder that the biggest magic of all is bringing characters to life and having an audience feel love. So there.
So there. I love that. No, I feel the same way about the team. It was amazing to be able to come in and work with people who I truly admired, respected, and loved working with. And can I just say, Jerry, if you had to think of one word, because I have a word in mind, if you had to think of one word that you talked about putting these 62 films together, do you remember what it was?
Valentine?
No, seamless.
Okay, that too. Yeah, the stream of consciousness, sort of seamless quality is something that that I think we all kind of got used to, but it was rather unusual.
Yeah,
I think that seamlessness is obviously, great credit to you, Jerry, and Ellen, certainly in the pre-conception phase, and I have no idea. I think if you're going to do a film like this, which is essentially a celebration of the entire history of filmmaking from the very beginning, you approach it with a great deal of respect. You want to evoke those wonderful golden memories that people have had. And at the same time, technically, obviously in this case, the imagery was taking a huge leap forward in terms of the intricate interactive effects that were built into the show. And again, I've said this to other people. I've said, Jerry Rees is probably the only director that I've worked with who has the kind of mind that can embrace creatively a task like this, a challenge like this, but as well be fully ready to manage the incredible amount of technical matters that accompanied the production. I mean, it was really not just down to the last inch, but down to the last millimeter to make these things come alive. And of course, we had a wonderful effects team as well.
Well, and speaking of, Tim Landry, who was one of our main players for the effects, Tim Landry and Amy Jupiter, he's actually rendering a scene for me to look at right now. We're still doing CinéMagique together, and we talked lovingly about CinéMagique last night, actually. But yeah, that Tom, there was as Ellen and I were considering who would be a cinematographer, I remember talking to somebody that was full of technical sort of jargon and undoubtedly a lot of experience, but I just didn't feel any fire in the belly. And then I talked to someone else who had a lot of passion and fire, but had no clue how to get anything done. And in talking to you, it was such the perfect mix of somebody with, like you say, that knowledge of the history of cinema, a real thorough knowledge of equipment and options, not only for what's established, but for experimenting with things that might be, and fire in the belly. I just felt like there was the sparkle in your eyes and the exhilaration of what we might accomplish. And it was just great to welcome you in with all of that mix.
The whole going backward and going forward, which was really amazing.
Tom, what was interesting, there's a few things. The seamlessness that you were talking about, Ellen, we dealt with a choice of actually building a lot of things and building transitions into the shots themselves. And I wanted to mention a couple of those things and then throw it over to you, Tom, to ask about sort of some equipment choices to hearken to these different eras of filmmaking. But in regards to the seamlessness, like for instance, we had a scene where we had to go from a silent movie, beautiful castle that was in black and white, and then we had to segue into an office building where Harold Lloyd was climbing on the wall in Safety Last. And we actually did it with just a turn in one physical hallway that was built. And at the turn in the hallway, it went from castle to office building of the proper era. And we just did a camera whip pan following the actor, and we just changed films, changed eras, and there was no visual effect. It was just a physical build and an awareness of the equipment you were shooting with and the way things were lit in the different parts of the set. But that was one example. Another example was being on the Titanic and needing to wind up in Star Wars. And we had the water coming at him in the hallway, and he's backing up against the wall, and then just the wall suddenly opened, and on the other side of that wall that opens is the Star Wars set. And once you're on the other side, you realize, oh, that diamond-shaped opening that was opened behind him was actually the trademark shape of what was in Star Wars on that set. So once you were on the other side of that door, you realized, oh, it's that mechanism that's working. But again, it was just stream of consciousness. And I remember Julie Delpy mentioning that when she had finally gone to see our finished film, and she had a couple of things to say. One was that she finally got a good review from her mom, who was usually her worst critic of films that she would choose. And she said, "Oh, my mom actually liked the movie. It was great." And she said, "I was amazed at how we went from film to film, era to era, and you didn't realize how you got there, but it was so seamless you didn't think about it. You just accepted that in a dreamlike fashion, you were just proceeding through all these different places and times." And so she, as an actress and filmmaker herself, kind of felt delighted by what we had accomplished together. But Tom, you had a slogan, "Another day, another movie," because we had so many different sets and equipment that you were working with. So how many sets of cameras and lenses and approaches did you go through?
Oh gosh, I've lost track, but I can say that we went to great pains to photograph each of the eras and each of the productions with appropriate equipment. not so much for technical reasons, but it tended to draw us into an aesthetic. The black and white film where we first see Julie was shot in the 1:3:3 aspect ratio, which is anybody who watches the various movie channels will have seen films shot in the 20s and 30s and 40s, even early 50s, and that's what they'll be seeing unless they've been letterboxed. And it's kind of a squarish picture. Well, that affects the blocking of a scene, where the actors are going to stand, what types of camera moves we would tend to use. And then, of course, the use of black and white, an entirely different dynamic with regard to lighting. And but then, okay, we fast forward to 15 years overnight. The next day's call sheet has a spaghetti western, Sergio Leone, and we're shooting the emulation of 2-perf Technoscope, very, very wide screen with a lot of zooms and a lot of very, very genre-specific images. So without geeking out too much here about these stylistic and technical differences, hopefully everybody just went with the scene and didn't give too much thought to that. I will say that it was a delightful part of the creative/technical challenge. And by the way, I also think of our rooftop comedy scene where we were taking a Harold Lloyd. It was a Harold Lloyd send-up, right?
Right.
Yes.
The clock. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Safety Last.
Safety Last, an iconic film, and literally married a part of a shot done some many decades earlier with a film with a shot that we did on the stage, all in black and white, all in 1:3:3. But I was delighted by the lengths to which Tim Landry and the other effects folks went to reverse engineer the background. And again,
yes.
and forgive me, Tammy, I don't know if you have the composition of your audience, but for anybody who wants to think about the photographic challenge, it's like we had to get a lens, our camera lens, in space at exactly the right angle, at exactly the right focal length, and finally to put the film through the camera at exactly the same speed that they did below these many years ago. It's more easily said than done, because in the old silent era, before sound was recorded, that had to be at a very constant speed, cameramen would crank a camera within a range of speeds, and there was really no way of knowing what exactly had been the frame rate. This was reverse engineered by our wonderful effects mavens. Anyway, I remember that as a particularly challenging problem, and I enjoy seeing it on the screen.
And then also, I remember that Craig Stearns with the team that was building that set had to get the size of bricks and the rows of bricks and the size of the seam between the rows of bricks on the building size to match up, so that once you had the camera lens in the proper place and everything engineered, that the look of the bricks on the building would precisely align from our set into the old classic shot. It was quite amazing. And something you're bringing up there about the speed. This I thought was a revelation certainly for me and for the actors. Was the looking at the old silent movie footage, we've always seen it played back faster than it was shot. So it's shot, I believe, around 16-ish, but we would play it back at 24. So There's always sort of that antic comedic quality to everything. And you suggested that we go take a look at the films played back at the speed that they were shot, so you could see what the actors really did. And we did that, and it was startling to see how realistic a lot of the performances were. Granted, there was more sort of vaudevillian choices in some of the gesture and pantomime, but in showing that to Martin and to Julie and to Marco Leonardi, various people that had to portray the silent movie footage, they were startled, and I think they related to the actors in the old era much more directly because they realized they were portraying pathos and wistful joy and different things like that in a very realistic way instead of sort of mugging to the camera. And so they performed in a very different way when we shot our black and white footage than they might have. I think they would have been much more sort of caricatured if they hadn't seen that.
Yeah, that was much more sincere. Jerry, are you going to talk about Sightline? Because I thought that was an amazing thing that you figured out so that things would look right and people would look in the right place when they were.
Yes, Ellen. It was. I think we dubbed it Eyeline Theater.
Eyeline Theater. Yes, that's what it was. Yes.
And it was. We had the unique challenge in the theater of having elements that would play in the story inside the movie and then have to relate, either continue on a path out onto the stage or be perceived as being amongst the audience members. Everything from, say, in the Western, a gunfight, and you see bullets strafing across the dirt in the movie and then continue strafing across the stage out in the audience space. And then eye lines for actors inside the movie and on the stage. There's a part where Martin Short, his character, is back out of the movie into the theater space with us, but he is now looking at Julie, who's still stuck in the movie space on the screen, and they're sort of touching hands through the screen. And at that moment, we had to figure out, okay, giant screen. Characters sometimes are shot very large. Sometimes they're shot closer to life size. Who knows what when you're out shooting, it's hard to keep exact track of that. And then you're having to apparently make eye contact with a physical actor in the audience space. So the puzzle was, how the heck do you line that stuff up and know that when you're shooting, you have a pretty good eye line established? So the idea was, it suddenly just, the light bulb went off one day. We knew we had a live feed from the camera so that we could look at things and either to line up a shot and or play back after we'd shot something. And so the idea was, well, why don't we pretend that monitor screen is the theater screen and build a little miniature stage right in front of it and build the theater space so we know where the audience is sitting and we know if you're far right or far left or you're up in the high part of the raked the steep slope of the seating area. And so we just had that monitor be the movie screen and did a miniature theater to surround it and had a miniature person that we would put to scale on the stage in front of that. So we could stand the miniature person on the stage and then while we had the live feed from the camera, tell the person in the shot, oh, look a little bit more to your right, look down a little bit. Okay, now you're looking at the little figure. Somebody put a marker so that they know where to look. And so we could just on the fly, we'd cart this thing out into the desert, set it up, and you suddenly had an accurate way of tracking how things would play back in the theater, even though you were out there. And I remember us drawing a line in the dirt going like, here's where the bullet strafes come up to the movie screen, and then from here on, they're actually in the theater on the stage. So anyway, we carted that thing around with us. It was called Eyeline Theater, and I don't think I've ever heard of something before or since. It should be in a little museum in a glass case somewhere.
Well, there is a behind the scenes featurette that is on YouTube, which I will also link it below because it shows a little bit of that design that you were speaking about. Because we were talking about how I found it and I sent it to you guys. I was like, that's pretty crazy that there was any footage that was saved of the behind the scenes of this film. Because if you're thinking about it, this film shouldn't have been possible at all, considering seeing all of the films that are in it, because I remember the first time I saw it, I literally screamed when I saw Titanic, and I thought, how is this possible? Then I saw Star Wars, and then there was so much more to it, and I was like, there's no way that this film should have been possible, especially, you know, considering all of the copyright issues, which we had talked about earlier. But what in the world do you think was the... Yeah, go ahead, Ellen. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I spent half of my life prior to the actual production in the legal office. I'd never spent so much time in a legal office, running back and forth. Jerry, I have to say, did draw this entire film out. I mean, he storyboarded the whole thing, and then we hired a professional storyboard artist. I'm not quite sure why, but that's what we did.
I would do the roughs, and
and I would run from Jerry's office to the legal office and go, no, we have to have that film. And they would go, but, and I go, no, we have to have that film. And then I go back to Jerry and say, we can't have that film. And he'd go, okay, well, we have to rearrange everything then. And I'd go back to the legal office and say, no, we have to have that film. So, and they worked very hard, and we did end up with 62 films. So it,
right. And, you know, there were, you know, the term writing the film, when I was collaborating with Steve and various editors, and ultimately our editor, Pat Rand, who took us to the finish line. Part of the quote unquote writing process was just, we know that we have to get a certain sort of story chapter across. We want the two characters who are in love to go through some adventure, and they're kept apart, and then they rendezvous for a bit and are separated again. So we know that has to be accomplished. And then it was just like ideas of films where those kinds of things happen. What could be a complication that could thwart them, et cetera, et cetera. And then put a bunch of things on the screen and just look at them. And in the Titanic scene, I actually was fast forwarding through, just like speed searching through, and then saw the part where Jack is handcuffed and was like, wait a minute. I went back and looked at it, normal speed. You see the moment where he hears somebody in the hallway and he calls out to them. And I went, oh, that'd be so funny if Martin hears Jack and comes to try to rescue him. And so it was just seeing it on the fly, fast speed, going back, checking it, doing some quick roughs, going to the editor. He cut them in. I did temp voice for Martin and cut it together, and then I would go show the team and like, what about this? And people go, oh, that's funny. Let's try to do that. And then Ellen makes another trek to the legal office to try to get permission.
We even had a meeting about one of the Disney films. I think it was Pinocchio. We had to get special permission to use Pinocchio. And I was like, wait a minute, this is a Disney film. But still, it took all
Yes, yeah. I remember they said they sent just legal speak through the normal channels. I kept saying, well, why don't we pitch? Why don't we show them the boards? Like, no. So the legal department wanted to do it their way, and you were doing a wonderful job sort of being liaison. But in that particular case, it worked in many other cases, but in that case, they just got a hard stop from Roy Disney. It's like, no way, you're not going to be messing with our films. Well, I knew Roy, and so I was like, gosh, I have to talk to Roy. So finally, we pled the case of, let's go talk to him. Let's show him the boards, see if he changes his mind. Because, man, the legal speak of just saying, you give us permission to mess with your classic feature, it would be scary, obviously. So anyway, we went to meet him, and I remember sort of the parade to his door, and he just sort of looked over all the heads and went, oh, hi, Jerry. And they're like, oh, you know each other? It's like, yeah, let me sit down and pitch to him. So we pitched, and he just went, oh, this is going to be charming. Of course you guys have permission. When I read all the legalese about what you might change, he said, oh, that's going to be charming. Go ahead, do it. And then, Ellen, do you remember this? There was Eisner came through and was looking at a pitch, and there were a number of things that had come and gone. I remember we tried to get Singing in the Rain, and didn't work, but Umbrellas of Cherbourg, which wound up being a charming scene, and Tom, I'll talk to you about that in a second. So didn't feel like a compromise at all. It felt like another wonderful alternative. But in putting having Eisner come through and see all the storyboards to represent where we were at a certain point in trying to get legal permissions. A lot of them we had, some of them we didn't. Singing in the Rain was one that was sort of in the middle of maybe not. And so he came through and looked at everything, and he just said, "Oh my gosh, anybody who's on the fence about legal permission should see this presentation." I mean, that they would just want to be on board. And so I took that as a cue and just went, "By the way, Michael, we don't have permission for Star Wars and we don't have permission for Titanic." And he just paused and he looked at the room of people and he's like, "We have to have those films, don't we? I mean, we have to have those." And so we're like, "Yep." And he goes,
Yep.
I'll talk to James. I'll talk to George. And he worked his magic. I never knew what the deal was. I never knew what any price was. All I knew is that we suddenly had permission.
Yep. That's exactly. Yeah, we were hanging and hanging and hanging. Yeah. And then Craig came through with a set. Craig Stearns came through with that wonderful set for Star Wars. It was great.
Oh, and that's something I was going to throw back to you, Tom, is perfect segue, Ellen. Craig Stearns building sets for the movies, the various movies. I'm sure people would think, oh, you put characters through 62 films. It was a green screen shoot. Not so. We probably had maybe 10 green screen shots in the entire 25 minutes. Just a few. Most of them were carefully replicating the same sets that were in the movie that we were trying to pay homage to, and then detailing them, painting them properly, lighting them, shooting them with the right lens and equipment choices. Tom, the way you partnered with production design to convince all of us that we were just in those movies was sort of startling.
Well, Jerry, it's kind of you to say that. I think that all of us were on that page to make it as close to those movies as we could, to enter their aesthetic in every single way, which, by the way, it seems to me that you can't be successful at that unless you buy in 100%. You've got to have authenticity, not just because because the history cops are going to swoop down on you if you don't, but because it needs to be a full impression. There's a lot of stuff that affects everything, from actors' performances to camera moves to lighting, certainly, and Craig, whom I'd worked with numerous times before on music videos and commercials. And he did so much. He brought so much to that party. We were also dealing with time travel here in terms of the rooftop, the broomstick dance from Mary Poppins.
Mm-hmm.
I sat down with no fewer than 3 supposedly archival release prints of that film, not the entire film, but that sequence. And none of them were the same in terms of color balance. Well, here's the green one, there's the blue one, there's because the film is an imperfect, it doesn't age well in some cases, even with other good archival storage. So the question would be, which would we use? And you and I looked at the stuff and decided there was a more neutral version. Now, that being said, oftentimes we were forced to do things that were very counterintuitive. In other words, that rooftop scene is an example, Mary Poppins. To take an obviously fake painted backdrop, and then to light it in these lurid sunset colors, that would not be within the palette that we would work today. It would be way too heavy-handed. But then you plug in Martin Short, and there you have it. I mean, but it was that any less diligence or inspiration really from anyone on the team, and there could have been a sour note.
Right, and I loved that on the other spectrum from that sort of matching a very extreme style. On the other extreme, we had a shot that was outdoors in the forest, and it's when poor Martin takes an arrow and falls in the forest, and people are looking on sorrowfully. And I recall that I believe it was Technicolor thought that it was shot outdoors, and that you had replicated an outdoor scene inside of our soundstage for that moment, and there was sort of a great joy that you had actually fooled the Technicolor lab into thinking that you had shot it outdoors.
Yes,
I do recall that, and it was a very nice validation. But I also remember about that scene. Great credit to you and to the actors in particular. Here we've got a madcap romp through 60-some movies, and with all the gratification and audience fun that this adventure could possibly create. And that last moment, shooting it on the soundstage, I remember getting kind of choked up. I mean, it was a very, very nice moment between those two. And there was a heroic flavor. There was an underlying reverence, I guess, almost as if they were aware of the cinematic journey that they'd had in our film, and were celebrating that as well. I was very touched by it.
You know, I was too, and I'm sure both of you vividly recall this. And I talked to Martin about it later, and he actually called back and chatted about it a little bit. That particular scene of taking the arrow and falling, and then ultimately his sort of resurrection. The day we were supposed to shoot the arrow hitting him was 9/11, when the planes hit the towers, and our whole production and the nation and the world suddenly was in this horrible real life catastrophe. And it was such a strange thing, the symbolism of our character heroically leaping in front of the person he loves and taking the arrow and falling, and that around us that history was unfolding. And production was on hold for a while, and then when we came back, there was sort of a mending that we all needed, and I think some of that somehow wound its way into the character performance. But that was quite a remarkable time, and Marty called back and he said he had taken note of that sort of coincidence of events.
I've never had a shoot day quite like that one, in that that morning, Steve Hiller, our wonderful focus puller, and Linda Gasco II, were staying at a hotel near the one that Disney was putting me up at in the Valley. Right. And I swung by, and we drove into the stage together, and we heard the initial reports. Well, actually, my wife had given me a few minutes advance warning of what were the events in New York, and we heard further on the radio. Arrived at the studio, and as I'm sure Ellen well remembers, there was I was walking to the stage and saw the entire grip crew headed the opposite direction.
Yeah, everybody rushing up to get their kids out of school. Yeah, everybody was running and with their kids.
Yeah, and it was like then we gathered on stage to assess and to figure out what was going on. The production team were busily on the horn to actors and so forth, and but ultimately we held kind of an open meeting about what was going on, and I stated my thought that we should go ahead and shoot if we could muster up the people. And the studio, meanwhile, decided that wouldn't be in anyone's better interest, or that we didn't have the resources. But it seemed to me that shutting down a movie was exactly what, quote, the other side, unquote, would love to do. And
right. And I remember ultimately just opening it up to what would make people feel the most comfortable in the moment in the day. And then I remember finally, as people went to be with their loved ones, and then as it became sort of the added rumor of potentially downtown LA being a target, which ultimately didn't happen, but we were right under the tallest towers there.
Yeah.
So some of that came to bear. And then I remember finally sitting with Pat Churchill and Ellen. I don't recall if it was the three of us, but I remember finally it's like, the studio had finally shut everything in, and then finally we were the last ones locking the door. And it was a very somber thing, but I recall just feeling so much feeling of rallying with each other, and sort of feeling the symbolism of it when we got back to say, okay, now Checky Cario, playing the knight, is going to rip the arrow out of the chest of our hero, and he's going to stand back up again, and damn it, things are going to move forward. Oh, and I also wanted
tremendous catharsis in that.
Yeah, there was.
I was just going to say there was a tremendous, I think we all felt it, a tremendous catharsis in that that day when we came back and finished the film. We had a great group, and they responded brilliantly to overcoming that challenge.
Yeah, we came back probably almost better than when we left, which was amazing. And it was Martin Short that came in saying that he had gotten word that there was an unidentified plane heading to Los Angeles, which was one of many reasons that we shut down. But yeah, so it was an interesting day, to be sure.
Right.
And I also do want to tip a hat here to Colleen Atwood, who put together the costumes on this show. Because
perfect segue. I was just going to do that very same thing.
All right, you can take it from there.
No, go ahead.
No, I remember looking at the designs as they came in one by one, and how wonderful they were, and how, Julie Delpy was pleased with all her clothing, and that alone was amazing, that she changed with each costume change, and that was incredible.
Well, and I think we had was it Martin Samuel and Ronnie Spector doing hair and makeup, with Colleen doing the costume, and they're part of the teamwork to say, yes, the approach to the cinematography is brilliantly reflecting each era, each film, and the sets are, and sort of the approach to the storytelling is, but guess what? Everybody has to look, the way they dress, their makeup, the hair, all of that is vividly part of how that works or fails. And yeah, they were just extraordinary. And I just remember one that was such a fun thing, goes back to, Ellen, what you said about seamless, such a fun moment, having to do with Colleen's entire team and us working our way through a seamless transition, was as Julie Delpy is leaving her silent movie to chase Martin through now all the other sorts of color films of all different sorts. She comes to a broken window where he's smashed through a window, and in his storyline had gone from Some Like It Hot out into Once Upon a Time in the West, and he had smashed through a window in the process of going from one film to the other. So you see her now approaching that same broken window, and she looks exactly as she did as the classic silent movie heroine in the Chic movie, and she's in black and white and peering through that crack. And then she steps through the portal, and in one shot, as she steps out and goes through sort of shadows into the sunshine, she goes from black and white to color, and the screen widens. And I remember that there was a moment where Colleen had done a subtle change on her hair between the first shot where you see her looking through the window, and then the second one where she steps through and walks continuously out into this new movie, where her hair that was sort of tightly curled could now fall a little looser as she moved her head, and the camera came up closer and closer to her, so you saw her full figure in her silent movie costume. As she moved her head, her hair sort of relaxed a little bit. You moved closer and closer to her and lost sight of her whole costume. You were on a close-up. She looks up at the sun, and then it's like, gee, the sun's shining in my eyes. And so to shade her eyes, she puts on a cowboy hat. And she just reaches off screen and puts it on. You're like, oh, where did that come from? And you cut wide, and she's in a whole cowboy outfit. So it and it seemed effortless. And yes, it's done with everybody in the team just doing a little trick, but it didn't feel cheap at all. It felt sort of dreamlike and fanciful. But I thought it was amazing how, in terms of makeup style and hair, she could think in terms of doing something that was transitional and would mutate from one to the other and be very effective. And I just went, wow, I wonder, probably not many films ask her to do that sort of thing with her team, and they really rose to the occasion.
And I remember her like checking very clearly about the final scene, about whether we were actually going to do the Wizard of Oz in Technicolor, what we were doing there, because she needed to know for the colors of the costume. It was quite amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I also point out one thing with this is because since the film is an interactive experience with the audience, there is always a cast member on hand playing Martin Short to go back into the movie and then come back through the movie. And an interesting thing I found while I was watching the film and watching the production of it, the overall show, is that when the character returns through the screen, he has the suit that's ripped, just like Martin Short's is ripped in the film because of the machete. And I thought, well, these are the little nuances that make this film what it is. Everybody's paying such great detail into every shot, every way that it looks overall, and how everybody reacts. And it's one of those things that just sends chills through you, because that is what great filmmaking it is. It's great filmmaking at its best, basically, because everybody's bringing their A game, and there's nothing that can recreate that, I don't think, at all, especially with this type of project.
Yeah, that moment where Martin steps back out from the movie into the audience space. The sword has ripped open the screen, and by the way, the person that posted that final screening sat in kind of a prime spot to make all that perspective work well. But that was another time where our Eyeline Theater and various things really mattered, because as you notice, the audience experience is to watch somebody step through, apparently just walk towards an opening in the screen on the movie side, and then step through it with backlight and vapor belching through this rip in the screen, and step without any cuts onto the stage physically. And so we had to shoot that knowing exactly what the projection scale was going to be, and knowing that our humans would be exactly human size at the plane of the screen, so that you wouldn't see a size shift when it went back and forth between a physical and filmed actor. So that also was just a technical consideration.
And also, with the Star Wars scene we were talking about, I just want to note, Julie is probably the first female stormtrooper. Look at that!
Yes! Oh, and
I love seeing her shoot that gun. It was great.
She loved that, by the way. She really dug being a stormtrooper, and she loved the Star Wars set. And I think she got a couple of those panels sort of on the side to put in her house.
Good.
That she just she wanted to walk down a Star Wars hallway at home.
I was going to say, did any of you get to keep any movie memorabilia or props or costumes from this film?
Gosh, I don't.
No, but I have a picture of me in the Stormtrooper helmet. That's pretty good.
Yeah. It's something that
I kept a couple of my call sheets.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Right.
Got some storyboards and stuff. I felt so fortunate that we had such a trooper performer in Martin and in Julie. But Marty had to do things like the underwater scenes.
Yeah, and how was that? Because he had to be in a water tank for a full day almost.
Yes, and what was it? About 18 feet deep, I believe.
Yep.
Oh my gosh.
It's a big tank down at the near the John Wayne Orange County Airport, and that I'm sure Ellen was heading the search for that, and not that easy. You can't shoot underwater material very easily because the water gets really cloudy the minute you put an actor in costume into the water. It immediately starts to cloud up, which of course is exactly what you don't want, generally speaking, but you certainly don't need it or want it when you're doing green screen, underwater green screen. First and last time that I did that. Oh, no, excuse me. I did it when I was directing. No, actually, based upon that wonderful education, courtesy of the Walt Disney Company, I learned carried forward what we learned on that shoot to when I was directing a commercial in Germany, an underwater commercial with mermaids, about 4 years ago. And I said, okay, first of all, we have to have clean water and huge pumps, and it has to be warm enough so the actors don't, right. It all worked out nicely. But that was a very nice way. I believe that was post-production, wasn't it? We went in after everything else was done.
Yeah. And the thing that's really surprised me, and one of the things that I was just sort of startled me in a good way about Martin Short, is I went to him at the beginning of the day and I showed him the storyboards of all the different angles that I needed to get, and it's both exploring and waving into one movie and seeing people in the second movie, and then looking around, encountering Pinocchio and talking to Pinocchio, and then swimming from Monstro. And so part of it was panic, part of it was kind of conversational. And so I went through all these boards and I went, well, I know this is not going to be a comfortable day for you. This is going to be a very tough day. So what's your biggest concern just about the day? And he said, well, I'm afraid to get in and out of the tank too many times. And I said, oh, well, that's good to know, because I was going to get you out of the tank after every single setup, because I thought that was being kind to you, to let you have some time to sort of detox and relax and everything, and get ready for the next challenge. And he said, no, I'm afraid I'll get cold, and I'd much rather stay under as long as possible and come out as little as possible. I said, really? Okay. So then I sat with him and I rearranged the storyboards to go, well, these 3 setups are pretty similar, so we could shoot them all while you're down. And so he felt much more comfortable knowing that was the plan. And then I went and conveyed it to Tom and the whole team. And so he went in fully clothed, and the routine was he had his regulator on a long hose to breathe with, and he had a companion diver. And once I was ready for the shot, and I cheated. I had an underwater speaker. I could talk to him while I was dry, so I was not scuba diving too. But I would talk him through the scenes, and he would shake his head yes or no or thumbs up or whatever to indicate that he understood me. And then we get ready to shoot, and then he had to hand his regulator, like take his last breaths, and hand his regulator to his companion diver. And then he had to clean the bubbles off his face, because you invariably get bubbles collecting as you're breathing with a regulator. And then he was ready for the shot. And then when he finished the shot, and believe me, he did not rush. He took his time to make the shots play. Then he was so far down, he couldn't swim to the surface to get a breath. He had to trust his diver to come back with the regulator, put it in his mouth for him to breathe again. And I was just amazed that he showed that level of comfort and focused on the performance in a situation like that. And anyway, it was, and so as a result of our conversation and him letting me know that he wanted to stay down in group shots rather than come out after each one, and then with his tremendous poise while he was doing that, you remember we wrapped way early? It's like there were people
Yes, I was going to say exactly that. And this could have been a very daunting experience for everyone, were it not for the fact that Jerry Rees knows how to wrangle a lot of technical aspects without sucking the life out of a scene. And Martin Short is an actor who, likewise, I wouldn't be surprised if he has some theater experience, but he knows what it is to figure out the technicalities, and then when he's in the water, he's ready to go. I remember that we were out of there ahead of the 405 traffic going north.
Yes.
Ellen, is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, sir. We actually beat the day. I was amazed. I was sure we were going to go OT, and we did not. So, no, everybody was surprised. That was a Jerry miracle, absolutely.
You know, another time where we made a day, but it was not quite in that with as much style, I would say. It was a harder way to make the day. Was I remember that you and Pat Churchill had really done some figuring and approached me early in the day and said, "What you're attempting today looks impossible." And I really do think that you need to,
like that.
and we really think that you need to take something out of your scope. We think you're being too ambitious. And yes, it was a lovely plan, but Lisa Campbell, my first AD, she did it. But I love that you and Pat, though, didn't just say, therefore you must, and here's the shot you have to lose. You said, this is our feeling, is that unless you really plan ahead, you're breaking the machine today. And so you and Lisa go and put your heads together and see what you think up. So I went and huddled with Lisa, and of course my passion was, I don't want to lose anything. It's like, this is the story we're telling. And so she was brilliant at rearranging things in the day and figuring a way to be a little bit more efficient. And so I remember we came running back and proposed, hey, here's a way where we've sort of disobeying and keeping everything, but maybe could do it. And you guys went, okay, we'll let you try. And we made the day barely. Yeah. And I remember you guys came in with a champagne bottle. And it was like, and you guys were like, congratulations. But I was so glad that you flagged the problem early, so we didn't just sort of stumble into it, and give us a chance to react and regroup.
What scene was this particularly?
Jerry, what day was...
Gosh, I don't remember.
I think asking Ellen, what day was that? I'm trying to recall, because frankly, on the photography side, of course, normally I had plenty of stuff to do, and I was not always intimately dialed into these kinds of conversations that you had. All I know is that this shoot came as close to running like clockwork, quote unquote, as any that I've worked on. And then you take into account the magnitude of the technical challenge, and it all becomes pretty spectacular. But so what day are you guys referring to? I never sensed any of them that had any more than the normal. I mean, any good director of photography is going to be highly aware of the clock ticking from the first moment in the morning until you finally wrap. But which one was this? I didn't get it.
I don't remember, but I do remember. You were always terrific, Tom. You always were like aware, and you came to me if you thought something might be an issue, and we knew ahead. But I do remember this day, and I do remember coming in with champagne, because Pat and I were both going, I don't know.
I thought it had something to do with the giant pie fight, etc. I think.
Yes, that's what it was. Absolutely, yes.
And I was going to say that another way that I appreciated with Martin and Julie, on the Martin side again, I remember there's the scene where it's a charming moment they're together in Umbrellas of Cherbourg, and he's being gallant and he's speaking terrible French, and she's amused by him. And there was a moment just before he falls into a puddle and disappears where he's making her laugh. And the way the schedule was stacked, the close-up of her laughing was the last thing in the day, and everybody was scheduled to be gone, except for just who was needed to shoot that scene, including Martin. Martin was wrapped and could go home. And I just stopped by his dressing room, and I said, would you mind like coming and having her look at you and like making her laugh? Because I said, no, nobody makes her smile like you. And he was like, oh, sure. And so he was off the clock, but he came and he got in her eye line and he did antics to make her giggle and laugh and sparkle. And then he went home, and it was just, he just was so so much a participant and giving in that way. I thought it was great. And then Julie did this. We would do this all the time, but this was like one really tangible example in that scene where Martin does step into the puddle on the street and fall completely out of sight. And then with no cut, she goes over to the curb, looks down at the puddle, and she jumps in the puddle too, trying to follow him, but it's just 2 inches deep and she doesn't go anywhere. I had originally planned that scene in that way, but her behavior was a little different the way I had first envisioned it, that she would go over and be amazed and reach down and touch the surface. And we would see her reflection, and we would go dissolve to undersea and start the next chapter. And she just looked at me when I was explaining, and she said, "But wouldn't I want to follow him?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess you would." And she goes, "I will try to jump in too." So she went over to the curb and held her nose and jumped in like she was expecting to follow. And it was such a beautiful little moment. It was like, oh, well, he disappeared. I'm going to go too, And it was just, it added such warmth and heart and charm to it. And that was just her spur of the moment having an idea. It was great.
It was a great moment. And there's a sort of a small backstory to the puddle itself. It began conceptually, if I recall correctly, it was going to be a physical depression at that point in the street and the set. I don't think we ever got around to actually designing it because it would have been daunting, But that Martin would jump in. Now, obviously, there would have to be a little bit of effects doctoring to make it work. But what we came up with was so much simpler and cheaper. It was basically Martin hops up and down and splats into a puddle. It's about 2 inches deep. However, in our effects folks would put motion blur to make it seem as if he were falling faster, and then they just moved his body down frame by frame until it disappeared. It was about a 6-frame effect. It worked beautifully. Nothing more to it than that, except he was against a green screen. And then Julie was perfectly set in real time to just stick her foot into the puddle, and there's no there.
And I remember there was an additional, to get the water element, Tim had asked us to, we had the camera locked, and boy, did we lock the camera for that. Lock the camera, lock the lighting.
Oh, yeah.
But he had us, after we did the Martin gesture, and as I recall, it was we made it a little deeper, maybe 5 inches or something to get a little more splat. But then he got out of the scene, and then we put on a wire they had devised a splat plate. It was a metal plate that had considerable weight to it and had various holes cut in it that we also dropped in the same puddle that made much more of a cascading splash in all directions. So first we had Martin do his physical gesture and stay very still, and then walk out of the scene, and then we brought in the metal plate, hung it, everybody got out of the shot except for that, and then let that do a splash, and then continued with Julie doing her part of the scene, and then married them all together. And as I recall, when we were doing, I forget whether it was color timing or mix or something, there were people, again, in the industry going, how did you guys do that? And it was sort of nice to have industry experts a little bit mystified, which was kind of fun.
That scene looked really complicated to do, because I was, even looking back at it, I kind of was like, how did they do that? I literally thought you built something underneath it that was like a trap door. So once he fell through, you could shut it, and then Julie could still continue the scene, since it was like a one-take scene. But obviously not.
And water was not as good in CG in those days, so a good deal of that was physical water that we got with that the metal plate splash thing that was comped in as well.
It was an interesting time for this film to come out, because there was a little bit of CG going on, but it wasn't to the extent it is now. So technically, most of the things we see in that film are very much the movie magic that you guys can produce. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. But I want to blow the hero whistle on behalf of the effects people too, because the success of that shot was actually in the basic fundamental decisions that were taken in executing it. Yep. Basically, and working backwards from the famous metal plate that Jerry just mentioned, that produced a splash that was that you could buy. That was it replicated what a human would probably, how a human would splash if there were a deep puddle in the gutter. And a big puddle that could consume a human. But the fact is that there, and this is true of all effects, if you're asking an audience to buy how a grown man can disappear into a puddle that, forget about how narrow, how deep it is, but it's about, 1.5 feet wide, and sort of what the dynamics of that are, and then, of course, how to keep it a light comedic moment as opposed to this is the way a guy drowns in the street. There are all these very fragile elements that have to be married together technically and creatively. So again, I think you've all said it very succinctly. This just flat out worked, and it was in defiance of how did they do it. It was just something that worked.
Yeah, and it was just wonderful to see so many of those things fall together. And when you have a team where so many different players have come to the party to bring something extra and to bring creativity and invention, and as well as experience, so that you're building on what you know, but you're exploring new territory together. It's pretty magical. And something else I was going to mention, Tammy, you were talking about the movie feeling so real and physical and not affects in the bad way. That when John Moyo, our stunt coordinator, was working with the teams, we had some pretty big, real physical effects things that as they appeared to happen, they really did happen. Like the flight of the arrow, the point of view through a bunch of soldiers fighting and people on horseback, and it was heading towards Julie, the point of view of the arrow. That actually was a physical cable cam that was moving on a line towards her through all of that activity, and it all happened at the same time. So that was a lot of prep and a lot of coordination, and on the set it was as spectacular as it was in the film, because we really did that stuff.
Well, I was just going to say, speaking of stunts, because you have that whole sword fighting segment, but then you also have the Western gun shootout where some people are falling off roofs and getting shot. So how long did it take to walk through those stunts just to make sure everything was rehearsed, everything was safe, how to insert Martin into those scenes?
Well, I remember Marty specifically. There's a big shot where it has to be, the gun battle where they're trying to shoot him, and some of the bullets strafe out onto the stage in the theater. So that we knew we had to have that moment because it married both dimensions. And so we'd worked out squibs, and that would go off in the ground. They're little small explosive things that you bury in the dirt, plus people just off screen that were very experienced marksmen with the equivalent of paint gun pellet things that would come in and hit in the dirt as well. And so we set it up, and Marty comes up to me and he goes, "So, Jer, just wondering how I'm supposed to go in through this gun battle and not sort of blind myself with the squibs blowing up into my eyes." So I said, "Well, I'll run through a take." And we had planned this. So I actually did the scene with them putting off all the explosive squibs and shooting the things. And so I showed him the path. And so I walked out and said, "Like that." And he was like, "Okay, let's go." But he was like,
Did you film you doing the scene? I really would have loved to see that.
Well, I know it went on video, but I'm not sure if it went on to film. But so, Jer,
Exactly.
How
That's
am I
a
still
really
going to
good
have
impression.
eyesight? But yeah, there was a lot of planning, and John Moe brought some team members from his group that were just really seasoned stunt people. And by the way, I mean, not that the audience has to know this, but it was like 106 degrees out there, and when we had Martin fall in the dirt and face up in the sun, I mean, it was like 106 in the sun. And poor guy, when he was doing the eye darts looking around, I think we got as many takes as were possible until he just could not look anymore because his eyes were watering so much in the brightness. And to fill shadows out there, not only it's 106, but then we had to do reflectors to fill shadows. So it's like, by the way, we want to shine bright lights in your eyes while you're in 160 degrees in the desert. And also we built that, the Western town that you saw out there there was nothing there, and Craig built it, and we shot, and then we had to take it down. So that was our town.
Yes, and every Disney executive was out there with us for some reason that I'm not quite sure of.
They all wanted to go to the Western town. I wish we could have left it there and made it just some kind of mysterious thing to discover.
Yeah, no, that was quite.
I would hope they'd want to go ahead and visit that set. I would have wanted to be there every day that you guys shot if I was a Disney executive. I'd been like, oh my gosh, we're bringing back these films that probably will never resurface again in the cinema universe. So,
but it really was 106 out. It was really hot.
Oh man, yes.
I was like, okay.
Where was that shot again? Was that on the Disney Ranch or
no? That was way out in Lancaster, right?
Yep, we were all the way.
You know, it's hard to find a place where you look at the films you're matching and you say, well, yes, it's the Sergio Leone Western, and you can look all the way to the horizon, and it's just desolate, and you go, well, where do I find that here? And we had to go way the heck out into Lancaster, Palmdale to find a place where you could just point the camera almost any direction and just see all the way to the horizon, a nice flat horizon that with nothing interrupting it, that looked civilized. I remember the only thing we had to do was be careful of. Occasionally there were like B-52 bombers for some reason, the old like long wing, slow flying things that we'd occasionally see, and you're like, oh, hold the shot, wait for the B-52 to leave.
Wow.
Some kind of Air Force base out there, I'm sure.
So what was the final reaction from cast and crew once everybody saw the film before it was shown to the audiences?
Oh,
I think everyone is. I think everyone was absolutely transfixed, and not that they had not been aware of the painstaking work that all were contributing, but it's still a making any film is a leap of faith, right? And often the crew, because they've got their own agenda that dominates each day, it's hard to have the overview, the big picture. And in this case, the picture was very big indeed, and it was very magical. And all my folks, all the shooting crew were totally amazed and delighted that they'd had a chance to work on it.
It was an amazingly good team. And I know Pat and I used to joke about how it was important that everybody had tunnel vision. It was sort of to settle ourselves down. It was like, it's okay, Jerry and Tom don't have tunnel vision. We'll be fine.
And Bruce Bratton, our composer, he just when it came time for him to work our story, he just at that point it was put together enough to where he was really seeing a lot of what the final effect was going to be, and he loved being invited into something where he could really embrace the emotions of the storyline. At the time, he said it was very popular for filmmakers to approach him and say, I want you to just do tracks, a few minutes, and I could slide it anywhere and it would kind of work. And I don't want you to address any particular emotion because then it would need to hit something that happens on the screen. And I just want basically ambience. And my invitation to him was the opposite. It's like, I want to feel this journey, this storytelling journey. And so he really, really got into it. And I remember there was talking about that scene in Umbrellas of Cherbourg where Martin falls in the puddle and then she attempts to follow. That was the only time we had a moment where we discussed an approach. Most of the time, it's just he would breathe things in, and I would just love it. And we had a spotting session where we just talked emotional chapters, and then he went off and created. But there was one point where we just had a little discussion about maybe backing up and trying again. And it was that scene where the first take of it was very vaudevillian, sort of comedic in the musical approach. And I said, but I remember that this is a romance and this is a moment of parting where they thought they were together and it was a joyous time, and now there's sort of longing again, and it's going back to that. And she was like, I don't know. But then he tried it and he went, oh my gosh, I really feel it now. And that's where it belongs. But so he would do that kind of shaping of emotion, and he just loved being invited to really address the emotions as they happened. And he had made an original theme for us. And something I know from the technical side, there were so many things the rest of us faced during the shoot, but something that he had to face that he was so proud of with the orchestra was near the end, when you're having the sort of sorrowful goodbyes before the happy reunion at the end. There's a scene from Casablanca, and it's here's looking at you, kid moment. And that original film footage had the dialogue and score as time goes by was married to it, and we could not strip it out. We could not get separate dialogue and music stems, and so he had to do the daunting task of writing his CinéMagique melody and then having it seamlessly join a little reprise of As Time Goes By to play his orchestra with that orchestra, and then segue back without you hearing any hiccup into taking the lead with the CinéMagique theme again. And and it's sort of the overall thing, it was just a moment, but it was a particular challenge for him, and he was so happy when that was just sort of graceful and seamless, as you said, Ellen, by the end. And then he told me a little story later. He said that he liked to just put on, had a collection of various composers that he admired, including his own tracks, of course. But he put it on random play. And he just said when he was going around the house, he just liked to have some of that in the background. And he said that something caught his ear, and he was like, oh, that's an interesting piece. Who did that? And he ran over to look at his computer, and it was his own track from CinéMagique. And he was like, oh, it's like he said, I was in such a different headspace when I was writing that I even surprised myself. So I thought that was pretty cool. And Ellen and Tom, did you have the pleasure of going to the actual theater venue, to the space during our run?
No, regrettably. And it was literally on my hit list for years, and I used to go to Europe quite often, and I did a huge job for Volkswagen, and I was in and out of Paris numerous times. But what can I say? Lame excuse, no excuse. I totally did not make that trip out to the park, because I recall that was. Disney Paris is kind of out on the outer ring, right?
It is quite far out, yes.
Yeah.
It never quite coincided with, because I never had a full day, and I blah blah. Hey, I'm sorry for making all these excuses. Let's just say I didn't see it, and I will always regret it. Now, on that topic, are there any plans afoot to release it in a different format, or not a different format, but well, it would have to be a different format, but a different way?
I do not know, but I was just going to say that going out for the opening of that park, I did have the opportunity to see it on that trip a few times with an audience, and I think I've seen it like 5 times in the space, but mainly around one extended trip. And then I was, then there were like 14 years after that where I did not get to see it. But there, the magic you were talking about that we all felt, and we did have a wonderful cast and crew screening where we all got to see what it amounted to, except for the theater effects. Mm-hmm. But I've got to say, sitting amongst the audience in the venue, there were these extra things that even heightened the magic more. And like one of them was in every show when the host says, welcome, and you think you're going to see a Valentine to a Century of Cinema, a clip show, and ask you to please shut off your phones so as not to disturb your neighbors. And then the film starts, and you think you are watching the clip show, and a phone rings. And the guy is like, hello? And everybody in the audience is like shushing him. And there were some people really in the early days where they're like, oh, idiot, cowboy, like these things. Just like totally. And we had to have a security person ready to defend them in case they got attacked. But to see that happen in sort of the theater of it all, in addition to the movie, there was this extra sort of adrenaline that was happening in the space, and then there was that magic moment where he's on the screen and he's physically actually casting a real shadow, and Julie Delpy and Marco Leonardi playing the Sheik, where they all stop acting on the screen and are annoyed by this guy that's making noise in the theater, and Marco tries to literally punch him through the screen, and it doesn't work because the screen is in between, and he shakes his hand, ouch, that hurt. But when you have this tiny little human really casting a shadow on the screen and these giant projected people trying to do something about it and being frustrated, the storytelling just was so engaging. And then, of course, the magic moment where Alan Cumming casts his magic out at that person, and the physical person is actually enveloped in a plume of smoke and then disappears. And I got to work with David Steinmeier, I believe is his name, who was one of David Copperfield's illusionist engineers. And it was great collaborating with him in the early days to figure out how some of that stuff could even happen. But when the person physically disappears in the audience space and reappears in the movie, it was such a delightful thing. And then at the end, and I'd say this gave me goosebumps, even though we had together, our whole team had built this frame by frame, pixel by pixel, it still gave me goosebumps as a magic moment at the end when, the two of them are separated. Martin has come out through the sword rip, and he has invited her to follow. And when she tries to follow him, the screen snaps shut in her face, and they're trapped, her inside the screen, him outside the screen, and they're touching hands through, and it's just this sad separation. When Alan Cumming takes pity on them, and he creates a doorway in the screen. It just appears as a visual film effect, but when the physical actor tries it, it actually works, and he puts his head through, and his head is projected, and his body is physical. And the audience will really seem to love that moment of half projected, half physical person. And then goes in, closes the door, and they're about to embrace, and he gives her a gesture like, wait, not yet. And he reaches over and peels the door off the screen, wads it up, and throws it away, and there's no hole left in the screen. I mean, that gave me goosebumps, even though, Tammy, I could show you sometime. I still have the home video footage where I went into After Effects and mocked up that moment in my kitchen, in my dining room. I have like me doing the first, like, what if we did this? But when it was everybody had gone through the final production, had made it magical, and you had the physical aspect of an actor really doing it in front of 1,100 people. And he could wad up the door, and there was no hole in the screen. I got goosebumps. It really was magic, sort of exponential when it was in the real space. So I love being able to see it there a few times.
I'm still upset that it's not there, and I do want to agree with you, Tom. I would love to see it make its way to the United States. I think Jerry probably has like 1,500 texts from me saying, hey, so are we still going to have it here in the US? I feel bad, but I just can't help it. I love the film, and I really am sad because I had planned a trip this year to go to Disneyland Paris just to see the film. I really didn't. I wanted to see the rest of the park, but I really wanted to see this film. And so it's going to be replaced by something else, I think a tribute to the Disney films overall. But I always thought that would be a perfect thing for the U.S. states parks, Disney parks. But again, Jerry was explaining, and I guess, Ellen and Tom, you can commend this, but the fact is, a lot of copyright, and that's a major issue, and it's not 2002 anymore. So do you think that's the main issue at this point, or?
It's likely a big issue, and it's funny in anticipating, not knowing how successful Ellen and the team would be in securing copyrights. Back in the beginning, we actually planned alternative paths for the original film. Sorry for that noise. The plan was obviously the film as you saw it, but we thought, well, what if you could not get the rights to certain movies? Well, I went ahead and did the concepts and storyboards for just sort of a nod to a genre, like our own Western, our own film noir, something that would be the way to stitch into the next film. And we actually did shoot, Ellen and Tom, as you recall, we did at one time shoot 2 versions of the Western. We shot one that if we had to create it entirely our own and we didn't get the copyright permissions, we were ready to do that. And thankfully they did come through, and we could do the scene as originally planned. But that was, and then also something, just a little trivia, is before we completely committed and everybody thought, well, this is the film we'll probably make. We're all in love with it. But the Disney folks said, well, why don't we just think of, before we commit, just come up with some other ideas and just see if we've done due diligence to possibilities. And so I think there were 6 writers for 6 weeks. And we came back in and had sort of a round table where people said, well, maybe you could do this, maybe you could do that, different ideas put on the table. And then I think it was Tom Fitzgerald turned and said, well, do you have anything to add, Jerry? And I said, well, I was at a coffee shop and I was doing a little sketch, and I was thinking the Red Balloon is a wonderful classic French film. And what if we had a balloon get loose in the theater and somebody chases it into the movie, and our balloon meets the red balloon, and the older, like a 19, 20-year-old older sister of the kid who lost the balloon has gone to chase it, and then there's a romance with her, and sort of like, oh my God, that could actually work. So out of that whole effort, the little sketchbook thing actually turned into a finished story reel where I went through the entire movie, like what if it was someone chasing a balloon that got loose. And we actually mocked up a physical test where we did project Safety Last, as which we did in the final version of CinéMagique as well. But we used one of the windows to have our physical balloon that gets loose in the theater drift through a window and go into the movie that way. And so anyway, there was a whole storyline that was around that, and we had a lot of fun with it. And then we had 2 things to compare, and people went, "Oh, the romance of the original is where we should go." So I was happy to explore an alternative, and then to a big sigh of relief to go back to the original inspiration and do Plan A.
It's just something that, if you are a film lover, it's what you've always dreamed of, stepping into those films and being a part of that experience. And it perfectly encapsulates the entire experience of being a film goer. So I can't thank you guys enough for doing this film. You know, even though I haven't seen it in person, it's really one of my favorite things that has ever been, you know, released by Disney. So thank you guys for all your hard work on this project. I hope that someday we might get some more behind the scenes footage or some extra behind the scenes, you know, photos, because you guys did a heck of a lot of work just to get this film done. It was done in like 6-9 months, or?
Well, I was on it for 3 years.
Yeah.
Whoa!
Yeah.
And but our what was our shoot? Ellen and Tom, was it 19 days or
It was pretty
something like
20
that? It was a very
20
very trimmed down schedule. But I mean, everything we needed we had, but as I alluded earlier to, Ellen's the whole production team really, but the planning went to the kind of efficiency that led to great shots and great moments and every hour of the day being used, as opposed to the experience that some of us have had on other projects where, despite the best plans, you look at the 90-day schedule that you finished, and when you see the final cut, 15 whole days are missing, or the equivalent of almost our whole schedule was not used because there was a lot of fat in there.
Wow.
So this was not fat. There was no fat in this. It was all content, and it was all. I can only say this, Ellen, and it's heartfelt. Ordinarily any DP will feel a certain amount of pressure, and they will be the first to hear the clock ticking. But you had planned this in such a way and given us the resources that we needed that I never felt that it was daunting. I never felt that it was something we couldn't do.
I'm really glad to hear that.
Thank you for that.
Okay. I do remember there was a day when there was some threat that there was going to be wind kicking up in the desert, and I was like, no, you can't do that. we got through that, so that was
the
good.
very idea of wind in the desert.
Yeah. Right.
And Ellen, I remember you and Pat Churchill just commenting, and I again, this was a testament to how sort of you didn't succumb to pressure or make us feel the pressure. But I remember Pat and you talking about this, and Pat just overtly said, this equates directly to the biggest pictures I've ever done, with the ambition per day of what's being accomplished. And, you know, you guys had worked with Spielberg and Coppola and Lucas and on and on.
And I hadn't. And so I was saying I have not done a great, big, huge film. And Pat said to me, Ellen, now you've done a great, big, huge film.
Right, because she had, I mean, her list is a lot of very, very big films. But for her to just say, by the way, just so you guys know, this equates to the biggest projects in Hollywood, and that she didn't panic or go like, oh my God, bring in Spielberg to take over for you or whatever. You know, she's like, no, I trust you guys to do it.
Right, and you were very flexible. It was like, Jerry, I'm not sure we're going to get High Noon, and you were like, okay, how soon are we going to know? And I'm like, I don't know. And you would be like, okay, I'll write something else just in case.
Right. Oh, yes. The tap dance.
The tap dance. Yes, the tap dance was amazing. There was a lot of planning in regard to schedule. There was a lot of planning ahead, and we did have 6 stages full of sets, and, you know, carefully changing out one set for another, quietly, so that not to disturb the set 2 doors down that we were going to be shooting in. So there was a bit of that kind of footwork that was sort of interesting, but it did all work out, which was quite extraordinary.
And controlling the weather, sometimes forcing the weather to be what you wanted, like the rainy set in Umbrellas of Cherbourg was all indoors. That was all interior set with the rain.
I have 3 CinéMagique questions I thought I'd ask you guys. So the first one is, if you could pick your co-star, let's say you had a Martin Short to your opposite, which co-star, any film star, would you like to choose?
Well, I'll just say
very...
Jack Lemmon. Just because I on my bucket list, I always wanted to work with Jack Lemmon. I think he was a genius, and if I could use my magic wand and have a moment to hang out with him, that would have been a dream.
All right, so I'm in love with Mark Rylance, so I would have to say Mark Rylance.
Well, I guess it falls to me now to give an answer to that question. I'm going to have to evade it, and I do
Could
so
it be animated?
in the following context. I am in love with acting, with the profession, and I have, like all of us, I mean, I've worked with so many wonderful actors that I can think, like, it wouldn't be a really good fit, but I mean, how great would it be to cast Laurence Olivier in the part? But, you know, he's a guy, so I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But, you know, the fact is that anybody who gets into this line of work without a healthy, not only respect for, but love of acting is in the wrong business, because ultimately what I do as a photographer is to create the moment in the movie for the writer and the director, but it's populated by people who we watch on set, we light with tremendous care, we do everything in our power to make the moment work, but not until we see them on the screen. And I've had this happen any number of times. I will be standing right next to the camera during a take, or maybe in my chair at Video Village. But in any case, I was there. I lived that shot and breathed it until we put it into the can with a printed take. And yet, when I see it in dailies, a whole new experience, one where the character lives and breathes, and it's magic that I have never ceased to be amazed at.
Our question 2, so I don't forget, there have been so many films that have come out since 2002. Of course, they updated the film and inserted, you know, different films for the door sequence. But if you guys could insert a new film that has come out since 2002, what scene or what film would you like to have inserted in the film?
Gosh, I almost feel like the Game of Thrones dragon should come through and threaten Marty and Julie. Checky Cario versus the Game of Thrones dragons.
Well, I mean, of course, I'm a little bleary-eyed because we've been watching Academy screeners for a couple of months now until blue in the face, you know, and I apologize. I'm virtually brain dead, but nevertheless, when I think of a film that I found very powerful, and that has iconography that I could see this somehow weirdly being plugged in, that would be The Darkest Hour.
There's so many. No, I don't. I like that one though. And
our final CinéMagique question, which overall is, the film ends with Martin and Julie going to their happily ever after, which is the city of Oz. So if you had to choose your happily ever after from any different film, what would it be?
Well, I would choose Oz because that's why I chose it for CinéMagique. that is. I love the idea of going over that hill with the poppies, and like the poppies being the hint, like, oh my gosh, I wonder if this means what I hope it means. And there's the Emerald City. I had, as a kid, I just so felt like there was so much heart and warmth in Judy Garland's role, and surrounded by the sort of eccentric family of characters. It's like they're all sort of damaged in some way, and she pulls them together, and by the end they sort of graduated to a forever family out of all the broken pieces. And I just have always felt like there's an incredible heart and warmth to that aspect. And so I had hoped that we would get the rights, which thankfully we did, to have that be the destination. So I take dibs on that one.
Yes, right.
I would have to answer generically, and I would have to cite a film that was quoted and emulated in our movie Titanic, which I loved and which I found on many levels just a terrific piece of showmanship. However, I can tell you one thing I wouldn't do. I wouldn't choose a scene where we have to end the movie with where they drown, where people drown.
Yes,
I would like the protagonists to at least to get a life preserver or something.
Yes, on the bow of the ship when they're leaning into the sunset. That's a much better moment.
So drowning is it's a downer. No pun intended.
yes.
Yeah. No, I don't. I'll take Oz. I think Oz is a good destination.
Well, I appreciated being on the journey with you, both of you, and the rest of our team as well. And I felt like it. The magic couldn't have happened without the combination of elements that we all brought. But I watched, just as a refresher, before jumping on the line, I watched that entire last show as somebody had posted it on YouTube, and I choked up near the end with them together embracing, and the audience when I heard the audience feel that moment, and they not only are applauding but we're like going woo, it's like they're back together, and the embrace, and it goes to the Gone with the Wind, to the crimson color and the music, and you go, well, and all those people felt it, and you go, and almost 17 million people felt that moment of reassurance and togetherness and love. It's just it's nice to know that happened.
Well, much credit to the folks at Disney, which is a
Absolutely.
studio that I've been has been iconic to me since I was a little kid growing up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in the projection booth at the Times Theater where my dad worked. That was my childhood, both the animated and the live action Disney product. And it comes not as a surprise. I mean, this decision to make the film, to back you in the making of this film in the way that it got made, and Michael Eisner going to bat for the seemingly impossible to acquire music rights. To me, that is like, it falls into line to what my image of the studio has always been, not to mention numerous trips to both Disneylands with my kids when they were little, and secretly, like, they're getting pretty sophisticated, but would it be okay if we went to, let's just do It's a Small, Small World one more time. What a pleasure, and yet not a surprise that it had this long lifespan, and that you were able to get support for the slightly longer version.
But I must say, CinéMagique is very close to my heart. It was an amazing project for me.
I really can't thank all three of you enough for joining me for this call, because I think that I was so nervous because I really couldn't find a lot of information except on Jerry's website, which I do want to plug because there are a lot of behind the scenes photos Jerry did post at jerryrees.com. I'll link them in the show notes below. But, this film is I just adore it. So thank you, all three of you, for your hard work and for being a part of this episode. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tammy.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Je suis un conseil de galon, mais ton français est toujours aussi nul.
Ah, merci.